So how will the General Assembly's just concluded 2016 session affect Hoosiers' daily lives? Well, some things won't change at all. Retailers still won't be able to sell alcohol on Sunday. Most Hoosiers still won't need a prescription to buy cold remedies containing the main ingredient in meth. And Indiana's civil rights law still won't protect members of the LGBT community. On the other hand, schools and teachers won't be held accountable for last year's disappointing ISTEP scores. Daily fantasy sports contests like DraftKings and FanDuel will be regulated as games of skill, and motorists should notice at least a temporary uptick in road and bridge repairs. Hi, I'm John Schwantes, and on this edition of Indiana Lawmakers, we'll take stock in a bit more detail of what did and what didn't pass this session. Joining me for the exercise will be the leaders of the General Assembly's 4 legislative caucuses. First, though, this report from Christopher Ayers of WFYI Public Media.
It's been 2 short months since Governor Pence stepped to the lectern inside the Indiana House chamber, laying out his legislative agenda and unofficially kicking off the 2016 session. Now, as the middle of March approaches, state lawmakers are packing up and heading home as the short session draws to a close. It's worth asking then, with election season looming, what big issues were tackled, or in some cases not tackled, by the General Assembly this year. First, what did the legislature get around to addressing? Right off the bat, lawmakers passed and the governor signed a bill that holds educators harmless for last year's ISTEP scores. Those scores dipped across the board after the Department of Education redesigned the test to conform to new education standards. Both chambers took up separate road funding measures, leading to the question to raise or not to raise taxes. Lawmakers also addressed a multitude of other issues: abortion, methamphetamine, criminal sentencing, and daily fantasy sports all got plenty of attention. But this session could be remembered for something the legislature declined to take up, that being a vote on whether or not LGBT Hoosiers should be protected under the state Civil Rights Code. After months of speculation that lawmakers might pass the measure to right the ship after last year's RFRA debacle, the Senate in mid-February declined to bring the bill up for a vote. So now legislators turn to campaigning ahead of the primary in May. Then summer study committees should provide a brief respite before election season truly begins. For Indiana Lawmakers, I'm Christopher Ayers.
Thanks, Christopher. Back in a moment with our weekly roundtable discussion. Indiana Lawmakers, from the State House to your house.
Purdue startups speak modalities, helping children and families coping with nonverbal autism to develop communication skills, helping people, changing lives. Purdue Research Foundation. Contact innovation at prf.org.
10 weeks ago, we began Indiana Lawmakers' 2016 season with the General Assembly's caucus leaders joining us to outline their priorities for the session ahead. It's only fitting that they would return to offer their assessments at the conclusion of the session, a so-called short session made even shorter by the Big Ten basketball tournament's need for the legislators' hotel rooms. I am pleased to welcome back Republican Representative Brian Bosma of Indianapolis, Speaker of the Indiana House of Representatives, Democratic Representative Scott Pilath of Michigan City, the minority leader of the House, Republican Senator Brant Hirschman of Buck Creek, the Senate's majority floor leader, and Democratic Senator Tim Lannon of Anderson, the Senate's minority floor leader. You know, if I thought about it, we could have offered cots because there's a lot of room here in the studio. You guys could have bedded down for the last few nights, but I guess you don't need the extra time. It appears that things are coming together, and in that regard, I should point out, full disclosure, as we tape this, there are still a few hours left in this session before it is gavelled adjourn, sine die. So if you hear out there listening or viewing some weird verb tenses, now we know why. What's the takeaway from this session, Brian Bosma?
Well, we were here 10 weeks ago and had common goals in many ways. There were a few different ones, but we wanted to address roads, we wanted to address some education issues, we wanted to address the meth and heroin outbreak in our state. And it appears that today we're going to be able to do that. 1001, the roads bill, takes ideas from each of the caucuses and the governor and puts into place a temporary but strong road funding program. I think we're going to have our teacher scholarship for the best students to go into the teaching profession. We've solved ISTEP issues for now.
That was a bill, of course, near and dear to your heart, since
right,
it bore your name as the author.
And we've addressed meth and heroin. So we're going to have some differences, some takeaways. Not all that was unanimous, but much of it was, and Hoosiers should be proud of their General Assembly for working together. Unlike Washington, we're able to accomplish things even when we disagree. We're able to do so.
Scott Pilaf, people should be proud, do you think?
Well, let's not be too over exuberant in our praise, but I'll start off with a couple of positive things. One, the roads bill. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it's a positive first step. And this was the first time that I can recall that all 4 caucuses and the governor put out a roads funding plan and offered it up for criticism. And candidly, if you took the best points of all the plans and you took some of the criticism seriously, I think you would have wound up with a work product that was pretty close to what we're going to be voting on and is probably going to be enacted. So I think that's a positive. Other thing that the speaker mentioned, methamphetamine, and I was actually walking up to talk to him yesterday on the House floor, and I happened to glance up at the board as the vote on the pseudoephedrine bill was going through, and I said, "Hey, that didn't pass without the Democrats." I say that as a point that was a bipartisan action taken. I think it was common sense. So a couple positives there. I suspect we'll take the remainder of the show to talk about some of the differences, but the people of Indiana,
know me well.
The people of Indiana should know that we can function when necessary.
Well, one thing I'm guessing you liked about the road bill, a good point, it didn't have a tax increase, at least at the state level. That was something you were adamant against. Actually put you at odds with Brian Bosma sitting across from you here, but in a strange twist of fate, perhaps, it put you in an alliance with Brent Hirschman. That was part of the story of this session, it seemed to me, was some of the unusual coalitions that sprung up on this issue and others. Your take on the session?
Well, I think that's true, and I think Brian's right. Scott is as well. We do find many opportunities to compromise. I think well over half of our bills passed were unanimous. We took 800 bills, winnowed them down to about 100 laws or so in 10 weeks' time. More than half of the bills were unanimous. More than 90% of them were bipartisan, and they make a real difference in Hoosiers' lives. Pleased to carry a bill for the minority leader and to co-author a bill with Minority Leader Lannon. There are a lot of things that as Hoosiers we can agree upon. I'm very proud of that. The transportation bill is a great example. These are difficult issues that we're struggling with all over the nation. We were able to come together and find a very strong consensus that's going to put a great deal of money into our infrastructure and help our competitiveness. Those are the kind of things we should be working on and being able to do so together.
Now it did on some of those issues though, it appears they're resolved now, but they came down to, as they always do, the final hours.
Well, of course, that's the way the legislature tends to
Deadlines
function,
tend to,
and so it's
to
not
drive
surprising. As we speak, there's still several hours to go, so actually we're in a pretty good position because I think most of these issues are pretty much resolved. You know, my analysis of it, of these major issues, transportation, ISTEP, I'm going to throw the Civil Rights Act in there.
Sure.
And I would say we've done a pretty good job of kicking the can down the road. We did come up with some temporary solutions on ISTEP. Basically, we came up with a solution that Glenda Ritz and Senator Stoops in our caucus proposed back in November as far as what to do on a temporary basis. But we're going to take a look at what we're going to do long-term as far as replacing ISTEP.
And you were talking about holding the schools and teachers harmless.
The whole harmless,
force
that's right.
The diminished
harmless
scores last.
Which we did in 2
provision.
weeks. We did
Those
that.
were the very first things that the governor
bipartisan.
signed, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in January, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. On the sustainability of our infrastructure, there just wasn't going to be consensus among the majority party there as to a long-term plan. So again, I understand we're going to form some sort of a super committee or something to take a look at that, and that's fine. Civil Rights Act, a big goose egg. We did nothing. So, I think some individual bills, as Senator Hirschman has talked about, are very good, very good. But as far as those 3 major issues, I would say we pretty much, are waiting for another day to address those.
And when you're talking about the Civil Rights Act, of course, you're talking about your desire to see it extended protection to the LGBT community, which obviously there had been thinking that would perhaps get to the governor's desk in some fashion this year, but it was ultimately withdrawn. Surprising to any of you about that?
No, this issue will take time. It will take time for Hoosiers to come to grips with it. It will take time for those who represent Hoosiers to come to grips with it. I have complimented the Senate. I think they addressed the issue with grace and dignity, all sides, not just the legislators, but to Hoosiers that had strong opinions on both sides. Difficult balance to find to protect freedom of conscience and religious liberty, and the balance with non-discrimination. So it was a great first effort, good discourse, and it'll be discussed for years to come, I'm
Of course,
sure.
some would say it was the second crack at it after last year in the RFRA debate.
Absolutely.
I guess if there's a sure bet in all of this, it's that this issue will be back.
Yeah, it's going to be back. You know, as representatives of the people, you know, we're judged. Are we ahead of where they're at? Are we in step with where the people are, or are we lagging behind? And this is a very difficult juncture we're in. You watch the two presidential races. There's plate tectonics. Things are shifting beneath our feet. I've always argued and continue to do so. I think the people, by and large, have already embraced civil rights protections for our LGBT community. I believe that they will in even greater proportions in the future. And I simply urge my colleagues across the aisle, you can embrace the change right now, or you can find that you've been left behind in the future. And it's not too late for them to change, but it's certainly not too early.
One thing that Brian Bosma has mentioned, I think, in fact, the last time you were sitting in that chair on this show, is that you already have 45% of Hoosiers in mostly urban areas who have this protection. Brent Hirschman, is that good enough? If you take the home rule theory to heart, well, then people who want it have it.
Well, I think it's worthwhile to have the debate on a state level, regardless of actions within individual communities. It does give you a sense of the feeling around the state. But I think one of the things that really wasn't looked at, the overheated rhetoric of the special interest groups on both sides of this debate were not helpful towards driving consensus on the issue. Obviously, strongly held opinions on both sides, and these are core constitutional values that have come into some conflict. It's a difficult problem to work through, but I appreciate what the Speaker says. Senate tried to do so in a reasonable, dignified manner. Some of the things going on out in the hallway and out in the communities were pretty disappointing, and I don't think they helped drive consensus.
But you can't ignore the fact that there's an issue here as to the state's reputation. And where does the state of Indiana as a whole stand on this issue? And so the failure of us to act this year, I think, is unfortunate. The issue might be, what are we going to do between now and next year? I assume we're going to probably have at least some proposal for us to continue to study this over the summer. I don't know if leadership will agree to do that or not. It seemed like there was the suggestion, we need more time. We need to study this issue some more. Well, then let's do that. And let's be prepared next year. The fact that, as you're saying, John, almost 50% of the state locally is saying this is something they embrace, raises the issue, why as a state aren't we committed to doing this? We need to do this.
Well, answer his question. Are you prepared to commit to some sort of study committee? I don't know what the vehicle would be, but something that would keep this on the
I'm
front burner?
committed to getting through the General Assembly in the next 12 hours. So we'll worry about what we study this summer afterwards. The caucus leaders collaborate on this. We'll discuss it, and we'll see. May very well be a proper topic for the summer.
You talked about some of the heated rhetoric on this issue and some of the tension. We saw a flavor of that this week also with the abortion issues, one which, of course, would prevent women from proceeding with an abortion based on sex, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, or the potential for a fetal abnormality. Only the second state in the country after North Dakota, if in fact the governor signs that. It was some heated debate, certainly some, maybe not heated, but certainly some emotional.
It wasn't heated.
And it always is, and it is
Right.
for good reason. I get very frustrated with these abortion discussions because we all know where this story ends. Now, the Speaker may disagree, but ordinarily these bills get passed. Members have the satisfaction of going back and telling their constituencies that they voted for them, and then they go straight to federal court and they get overturned.
Right.
I mean, we have to acknowledge that it's largely the courts that shape abortion policy in this country. I do wish that we can find it within our hearts one day not to subject the chambers to these debates when that's really where the things end up being decided in our courts. The other thing, you know, we had time for reproductive rights discussions, but we didn't have time for civil rights discussions. I think that's a tough argument to make going into a general election of why you chose one thing and not the other, but the people will get to decide these things.
Gentlemen, I mean...
I'm going to add one thing. So there are many, Scott, and I respect your opinion on this, and I agree that this is, for some people it's a moral issue, for some it's a religious issue, for some it's a personal issue because of personal experiences. So it is the hardest, I believe it's the hardest issue to deal with at the General Assembly.
You took the unusual step as Speaker of voting. You were with the 60-40 majority on this.
Because I just have to tell you that it's my position, and I understand everybody's going to have their own position on this, that an unborn child has civil rights too. The second that child is born, there's no argument that they have civil rights and they're protected by the Constitution. So we are delivering children that live at 18, 19 weeks. So at what point does that child have a constitutional right? I get it. It has to be balanced with the mother's rights.
You acknowledge, though, after the vote that it might be unconstitutional, correct?
I agree. This one was, the House passed a bill that had some consensus. Senate passed the second bill that we're speaking of now. They got combined in the Senate because the one didn't have a hearing in the House. It wasn't ideal. There's no doubt about that, but it is what it is, and people wanted to vote on it.
The bill's clearly unconstitutional. That's why there was a severability clause put into it, obviously, which is a waste of our time and a waste of the taxpayers' dollars in terms of defending these actions in court. So that's what's frustrating about this. Let me address what you said, Mr. Speaker. If the unborn have civil rights, certainly the LGBT community has rights too. And so,
I get that, but they are being
been
killed.
addressed.
I'm not saying that there isn't discrimination in employment, housing, and we need to address these things. But we have to acknowledge that we've lost 30, I think the number is 35 million children to abortion, and I'm not trying to get in a big debate about it, but it has a different flavor for a lot of people.
And Brandon Hirschman, you should weigh in too, because the Senate was very vocal on this issue, was last year when the House didn't even hear similar legislation.
These are always very difficult debates. I've often said the General Assembly does not create the culture, we reflect it. And these are issues of deeply held division between people in the general public and weighing very difficult issues. And so the debate in itself is a healthy thing. What the courts do, courts can be as political as General Assemblies can and really reflects the attitude of whatever particular judge hears it. So it's hard to tell, but I think the discussion, whether at the judicial branch or in the legislative, is worthy to have because these are serious issues.
And we talked about certainly the issues that were on all of your agendas heading into this, and obviously the big ones, the roads, I-STEP, and curbing illegal drugs. We talked about abortion, but daily fantasy sports regulation, canned hunts, that's been an issue that's been boiling for 10 years. Police body camera, really how the video, medical malpractice caps. Were you looking at my list?
No, I wasn't.
That raised for the first time since 1998. Right. Solid Waste Management District changes in regulation. Adoption records opened prior to 1994. You did get some time to do other things, apparently.
This is part of the reason why I said the public is well served by the Indiana General Assembly. And I'm not talking, Republicans. I'm talking Republicans and Democrats alike. And we solved a lot of issues. That medical malpractice statute has been critical for patients in this state and for the availability of health care to Hoosiers for the last 35 years. And if we didn't fix that this year, it likely would have been overturned.
It was not on anybody's agenda except Senate Republicans. And in fact, none of these I just mentioned. How come, if they're so important and everybody can do such great work on them, they're never in anybody's agenda?
People can't remember more than 3 to 5 things.
That's why I wrote it down.
If you can't say my agenda is 15 things. It's got to be 3, 5, something like that.
I want to raise an issue, though, that has finally emerged and it should emerge. We had a vote in the House regarding the after effects of Carrier Corporation leaving Indiana. Right. And House Democrats, Representative Macer, offered an amendment that would simply not reward Carrier Corporation anymore after they've already turned tail on our state and left. And that passed in bipartisan fashion. Now, it doesn't look like it's going to make it into law, but that opens up an important point and a new one of possible convergence and realignment between the two parties. We have to deal with the implications of trade on our state. And that's something to look towards the future, because you see likely the nominees of the two major parties are not going to have the trade positions as nominees in the past, and that's going to be reflected here in Indiana. It's one thing to cultivate a good business environment, but we're going to have to deal with the after effects of massive job realignments and massive job losses because of things that neither state government nor the people themselves can control.
When you're talking
I don't
about
think that-
coalitions,
I don't
that
think
brought
that's
Donald
exactly-
Trump and Bernie
Well,
Sanders together even, so
And,
that's
and it
proof
should
positive.
on the federal level, but as far as the state, Indiana is an extraordinarily heavily export-dependent economy, and we need to welcome businesses into this state. So, and we're seeing a 4.4% unemployment rate, historic low. What that says is that good companies creating good jobs are here, so that when one company makes a very short-sighted decision, that there's plenty of opportunities for Hoosier workers to say, we're going to get a better job at a better company who appreciates us more. And we've done that. In the case of Carrier, I give Indiana great credit. Not $1 of incentive that has been given to Carrier is leaving town with them. They've paid every
state and local.
state and local. They've paid every dollar back.
But people are frustrated. They see corporations being granted these incentives to create jobs, and then the jobs either aren't created or they're created and then they're taken away. And I live in a community where for years and years we saw nothing but plant shutdowns after they had received tax abatement after tax abatement. Carry the same situation. They took the training dollars, they took what other incentives were out there, and then they took their 2,100 jobs and moved them to Mexico because they could pay their workers $3 an hour. Now, unless, that shouldn't be the policy of the state of Indiana, that we're going to try to compete with $3 an hour jobs. I think the public's sort of fed up with that.
Storyline's 10 years old. Respectfully.
And it's
Indiana
hurt
is
communities
number
for
one
decades.
in the Midwest and in the top 5 list of every, whether it's Tax Foundation or Area Development Magazine, Forbes. We're in the top handful in the nation of the business environment here. Companies are flocking here from California, Illinois, Ohio, Germany. And so I don't disagree, Tim, with what you're saying, that there are some actors that, and we need to review our policies, but we are enjoying just an absolute renaissance of economic activity here.
Well, you wonder what the state could do regardless. I mean, it strikes me in some ways this might be as the Syrian immigrant issue that just went to federal court. I mean, certain issues about jobs migrating, as Carrier puts it, overseas. I mean, what realistically can the state of Indiana do other than say bad, bad, bad?
Well, it's very, very simple. We proposed it. One, no more goodies. I will say that it was my caucus that began the fight for clawbacks, tax incentives that are given, and the jobs not created. And the people of Indiana should get their money back when that happens. The other thing, corporate taxes are due to go down. Why should Carrier continue to get corporate tax cuts in the future when they're turning tail on Indiana, unpatriotically, I might add? And I know that's a strong word, but I think that we need to start saying it's unpatriotic. Companies are either committed to this country or they're
And
not.
Brant Hirschman's nodding for those listening on the
Yeah,
radio.
no, I would absolutely agree, but I think the bigger problem, Indiana has done everything it can to be an attractive business climate, but that's one layer. The overall layer is federal policy.
That's right.
We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. I ran the numbers. When Carrier leaves, there's a labor cost problem. There's also a 15% cut in their tax rate the minute they leave town. And this isn't a partisan issue. President Obama has called for corporate tax reform at the federal level. They haven't been able to get done what we've been able to get done here. I think we would see billions of dollars brought back in investment and millions of jobs created in this state if the federal government would stop spending money and lower the federal corporate tax rate.
Oh, so much more to talk about, but I think the Big Ten tournament fans are banging at the door, running your hotel room, so we unfortunately are going to have to call it quits. I do appreciate your willingness to come back for the second time this session and talk about the important issues facing our state. Again, my guests have been Republican Representative Brian Bosma of Indianapolis, Democratic Representative Scott Pilath of Michigan City, Republican Senator Brant Hirschman of Buck Creek, and Democratic Senator Tim Lannon of Anderson. The 2016 General Assembly has wrapped up another session. We'll wrap up our season with the journalist who covered it on the season finale of Indiana Lawmakers. Time now for our weekly conversation with Ed Feigenbaum, publisher of the newsletter Indiana Legislative Insight. Gotta take a deep breath. We were there almost. Ed, the LGBT issue, which turned out to not be the dominant issue we thought it would be. I listed a lot of things that got done this session. Would they have gotten done had LGBT been hanging over the debate?
Well, I think that probably would have sucked the oxygen out of both chambers, out of the entire State House. It was very difficult to kind of approach some of these things even before that issue came to the fore and not the floor, because everybody was kind of apprehensive and wondering about how to strategize on some of these things process-wise. Should we bring this down now, or will the civil rights and religious liberties debate get in the way? How do we handle this procedurally? And I think that once that went off the table, everybody kind of took one big sigh of relief and said, hey, we can get some other things done now, and they did.
And of course, now the abortion debate did have a flavor of what we would have seen or did see with LGBT in terms of the very similar battle lines, conservative versus more progressive. Where did that issue come from? That wasn't on anybody's agenda.
Well, I think that was another one of those things that was processed in terms of how it came down, and the way that ended up coming down on literally the penultimate day of the session kind of disappointed a lot of legislators and actually changed a lot of votes. I think people weren't quite expecting that there would be a concurrence motion on something that the House had not had an opportunity to, I don't even want to say fully vet. They hadn't even looked at that language at all during the session. It was perhaps the most controversial bill of the session when you look at the elements that Speaker Bosma alluded to in terms of personal conscience and all the different things that were wrapped up in that. And as a result, you had some legislators like Representative Sharon Nagel, Representative Holly Sullivan, who'd been strongly pro-life, really never voted for any kind of bill that had a pro-choice element in it, that got up and gave impassioned speeches on the floor among the 11 female lawmakers that were up there on Wednesday afternoon speaking about this. And they voted against it because of the way that it came to the floor, because they didn't have an opportunity for debate. And even though the bill overwhelmingly passed 60-40, I think that there's a lesson in that for some of the leaders when we look to the future.
Now, is that an aberration, do you think, in terms of this perhaps disregard for formal procedure, or are we seeing more and more of this?
Well, I don't know that it's a disregard for formal procedure. And we typically see some of this in terms of conference committee deliberations where things end up in conference committee reports that, gee, we just...
The old germaneness.
Yeah, and that seem to have come up for the first time. But typically they're not of the same kind of controversial nature and the kinds of issues of conscience like this one. So they don't quite rise to the same level.
Very good, Ed. As always, thanks for your insight. For more information, streaming episodes, and extra content, go to wfyi.org/lawmakers. You can also visit us at WFYI on Facebook and Twitter. Use hashtag Indiana Lawmakers. You can access live streaming coverage of the General Assembly on the internet as well. And remember, you can get our show on demand from Xfinity and Bright House Networks. Well, that concludes another edition of Indiana Lawmakers. I'm John Chwanis, and on behalf of WFYI Public Media, Indiana's other public broadcasting stations, and my colleagues Ed Feigenbaum and Christopher Ayers, I thank you for joining us, and I invite you to visit WFYI.org for more on the 2016 session. Until next week, take care.
The Visual Analytics Law Enforcement Toolkit, or VALET, developed at Purdue University, brings critical data and analytics to police departments instantly, so officers are a step ahead of criminal activity. To learn more, visit otc-prf.org.